For as long as I can remember, my life has been a relentless battle for scraps of validation in a household that seemed to revolve entirely around my younger adopted sister. At 35, I find myself reflecting on decades of emotional neglect and favoritism that have left deep scars on my soul. My parents' blatant preference for her was not just subtle. It was an overwhelming storm that drowned out every effort I made to prove my worth. From the moment she entered our family as a newborn, it felt like I had been demoted from being their daughter to merely an afterthought. The imbalance was suffocating. When I proudly showed my mother a drawing I had worked tirelessly on at age 5, she barely glanced at it, distracted by my sister reciting the alphabet again. It wasn't just indifference. It was a calculated dismissal of everything I did well. As we grew older, this toxic dynamic only intensified. In elementary school, while I excelled academically without needing extra help, my sister struggled with reading. Yet, instead of celebrating my achievements, my parents devoted hours each night to tutoring her, leaving me to navigate my successes alone. Their attention toward her became almost obsessive, while I was left to fend for myself emotionally. Middle school brought another painful chapter. When I won first place in the science fair feat no one else in our school had achieved that year, my parents weren't there to celebrate because they were attending her dance recital. Her hobbies, struggles, and even failures always took center stage, overshadowing my accomplishments like a dark cloud blotting out the sun. The disparity between us wasn't limited to academics or extracurriculars, it permeated every aspect of our lives. While I buried myself in books, studying late into the night and striving for perfection, she partied and socialized freely. My hard work earned me scholarships and accolades, but these milestones were met with lukewarm praise, if acknowledged at all. Meanwhile, her mediocrity was celebrated as though she were destined for greatness. Every report card, every award ceremony, every family gathering reinforced the message that I would never be enough not compared to her. This constant comparison carved wounds so deep that even now, years later, I feel the sting of rejection whenever I think about those formative years. What made it worse was the sense that I was fighting an invisible enemy. No matter how flawless I tried to be, how many exams I aced, how many leadership roles I secured, it never mattered. My efforts were dismissed, minimized, or completely ignored. The more I achieved, the more distant my parents became. It was as if my success was a threat to the fragile pedestal they had built for my sister. And yet, despite knowing intellectually that none of this was my fault, the weight of their disapproval crushed me. I internalized their neglect, believing I must somehow be unworthy of love and recognition. Little did I know then that this was only the beginning of a much darker saga, one that would unravel secrets buried deep within our family's history and force me to confront truths too painful to imagine. Despite the suffocating weight of my family's favoritism, I refused to let their neglect define me. If anything, it fueled a fire within me, a relentless determination to prove that I was more than just the overlooked daughter. My escape came in the form of academics. While my sister partied and basked in our parents' endless adoration, I buried myself in books, studying late into the night with an almost obsessive zeal. Every plus on my report card felt like a small victory against the tide of indifference that surrounded me. But no matter how many accolades I earned, they were never enough to pierce through the invisible barrier my parents had erected around my sister. It wasn't until high school that I realized education could be my ticket out, not just from home, but from the toxic dynamics that had poisoned my childhood. The day I received the acceptance letter from one of the most prestigious universities in the country was supposed to be monumental. I had secured a half scholarship based on merit, an achievement so rare that even the guidance counselor called it life-changing. Yet when I brought the news home, my parents barely reacted. Their lukewarm congratulations paled in comparison to the fuss they made over my sister's latest hobby, baking cupcakes for her friends. The contrast stung worse than ever before. As I packed my bags for college, I couldn't help but notice how much effort they put into comforting my sister about my impending departure. "She miss you so much," my mother said, hugging her tightly while barely glancing at me. That moment solidified something deep inside me. If I wanted validation, I would have to find it elsewhere. College became my sanctuary, a place where I wasn't constantly overshadowed by someone else's mediocrity. For the first time in my life, I was evaluated solely on my own merits, not as a footnote to my sister's existence. I thrived academically, earning honors and scholarships that further cemented my path toward success. Socially, I blossomed too, forming friendships with people who genuinely appreciated me for who I was rather than what I could do or achieve. These connections filled a void I hadn't realized existed, offering glimpses of the unconditional support I craved but never received at home. After graduation, armed with a degree and unwavering resolve, I entered the corporate world. Climbing the ladder wasn't easy. There were long hours, cutthroat competition, and moments when self-doubt threatened to consume me. But each promotion, each milestone, felt like reclaiming pieces of myself that had been stripped away by years of emotional neglect. By 35, I had ascended to a senior management role at a Fortune 500 company, a position that commanded respect and admiration from colleagues and peers alike. On paper, I was living the dream. Yet beneath the polished exterior lay a gnawing emptiness. No matter how high I climbed, my accomplishments seemed to vanish into thin air whenever I returned home. My parents dismissed my career achievements as mere obligations, often comparing them unfavorably to my sister's sporadic attempts at entrepreneurship. "At least she's trying to find her passion," they'd say, oblivious to the irony of praising failure while dismissing hard-earned success. It reached a breaking point during one particularly painful holiday dinner. My sister proudly announced her newest venture, a pet-related social media app, and our parents practically threw confetti in celebration. Meanwhile, when I tried to share details about a multi-million-dollar project I was overseeing, their eyes glazed over. "That sounds complicated," my father muttered dismissively before turning back to my sister. In that instant, rage bubbled up inside me, hot and uncontrollable. How dare they reduce years of blood, sweat, and tears to complicated? But instead of lashing out, I swallowed my anger, letting it fester like an open wound. Little did I know then that this simmering resentment would explode into chaos during a birthday party that would change everything forever. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a joyous occasion, my sister's extravagant birthday party. The house was transformed into something resembling a wedding venue, complete with catered food, an open bar, and even a live band. It was the kind of celebration I had never experienced for myself. My last birthday dinner consisted of 4 people around the table, most of whom barely acknowledged my presence. As the evening unfolded, I tried to blend in, forcing smiles and engaging in polite small talk with relatives who barely glanced at me. But beneath the surface, the old bitterness simmered like a pot about to boil over. It wasn't until halfway through the night that things took a devastating turn. My sister, already visibly intoxicated, stood up on her chair and tapped a spoon against her glass to get everyone's attention. At first, her toast seemed harmless enough, a few words of gratitude to our parents and thanks to the guests for coming. But then her tone shifted, dripping with venom as she turned her gaze directly toward me. "I'm especially grateful to Mom and Dad," she slurred, her voice carrying across the now silent room, "because they've always treated me better than their own daughter." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She went on mocking my career, calling me an icy work robot who didn't know how to enjoy life or prioritize family. Every insult felt like salt being rubbed into wounds that had festered for decades. She mocked my lack of romantic relationships, my dedication to my job, and even insinuated that I'd slept my way to success. By this point, tears were streaming down my face, but no one intervened, not our parents, not the guests. They all stared awkwardly, frozen in place as if witnessing a car crash they couldn't look away from. For years, I had silently endured her subtle jabs and passive-aggressive comments, but this public humiliation shattered whatever fragile hope I still clung to for reconciliation. Just when I thought the night couldn't get worse, my aunt, the biological mother of my so-called sister, stepped forward. Her face was a mask of fury as she confronted the crowd. In a voice trembling with emotion, she revealed the truth. My sister wasn't adopted from foster care. She was her biological child. My parents had agreed to raise her after my aunt, young and terrified by an unexpected pregnancy, decided she wasn't ready to be a mother. As the weight of her confession sank in, chaos erupted. My sister screamed accusations, my parents shot daggers at my aunt, and other family members whispered among themselves in shock. Amidst the pandemonium, my aunt approached me, her expression softening as she handed me an envelope. "Don't open it until I'm done talking," she said firmly. Inside was a blank check, an act of reparation for years of emotional neglect. My aunt explained that she had saved this money for my sister's future, but realized, after witnessing her behavior, that it belonged to someone more deserving. Though guilt gnawed at me for accepting something meant for my sister, I also felt a strange sense of vindication. Someone finally recognized the injustice I had endured for so long. As the argument escalated, my sister lunged at me in a drunken rage, screaming that I was trying to steal everything from her. Our parents physically restrained her, but the damage was done. That night, I fled to my room, locked the door, and cried until there were no tears left. Years of pain, resentment, and feeling invisible poured out of me in waves. I ignored the pounding on my door, the desperate pleas from my parents, and the angry texts flooding my phone. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully confront the depth of my hurt and the realization that I deserved better. In the days following that disastrous birthday party, I found myself consumed by a whirlwind of emotions: anger, betrayal, and an overwhelming sense of injustice. The revelation about my sister's true identity had shattered any remaining illusions I clung to about our family being functional. Yet, amidst the chaos, something inside me stirred a fierce determination to confront the toxic dynamics head-on. For years, I had silently endured their favoritism, hoping they would eventually see how deeply it hurt me. But now, after everything that transpired, silence was no longer an option. I decided to lay out clear terms for reconciliation. A public apology from my sister for her cruel words at the party and for years of subtle jabs before that, an acknowledgement from my parents of their blatant favoritism, and a commitment to treating us equally moving forward. It wasn't just about vindication. It was about creating a foundation where healing could begin. At first, my demands were met with what seemed like genuine remorse. My parents agreed to therapy sessions as a family, and my sister begrudgingly sent texts apologizing, but only for what happened at the party, carefully sidestepping accountability for her past behavior. The negotiations dragged on, each conversation more exhausting than the last. My sister oscillated between gaslighting, "You're overreacting," and guilt-tripping, "How can you tear this family apart?" Meanwhile, my parents proposed compromises that felt hollow: a private apology instead of a public one, vague promises without concrete actions. Every attempt to hold them accountable unraveled into deflection or denial. As weeks passed, the weight of their resistance began to crush me. Sleep became elusive, my phone buzzing incessantly with manipulative messages from my family. They pleaded, accused, even enlisted mutual friends to mediate, all in an effort to wear me down. It was during one particularly grueling exchange that clarity struck me. My therapist's words echoed in my mind. "Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's necessary." Suddenly, I saw the truth glaring back at me. Meaningful change cannot be forced. No matter how desperately I wanted resolution, my family simply wasn't ready or willing to meet me halfway. Their attempts at compromise weren't sincere efforts to mend our fractured relationships, but desperate maneuvers to preserve the status quo. That realization hit me like a freight train. With trembling hands, I drafted an email retracting my conditions, not because I believed they were unreasonable, but because I understood that pursuing reconciliation under these circumstances would only perpetuate the cycle of pain. I needed space, not just physically, but emotionally. I told them I couldn't continue negotiating when their intentions remained rooted in avoidance rather than growth. Sending that email felt both liberating and devastating. Liberating because I was finally prioritizing my mental health, and devastating because it meant letting go of the hope that things could ever truly improve. Their reaction was immediate and explosive. Calls flooded my phone, texts bombarded my inbox, and relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reappeared, urging me to reconsider. Some accused me of being selfish, Others begged me not to abandon them. The emotional warfare intensified, leaving me drained yet resolute. For the first time, I stood firm, blocking their numbers and setting up filters to shield myself from their relentless attempts to manipulate me back into submission. Though guilt gnawed at me, I reminded myself of the years I spent feeling invisible, unimportant, and unworthy. This wasn't about punishment, it was about survival. The fragile truce that had tentatively held our fractured family together shattered completely one Saturday evening when my sister, fueled by alcohol and rage, stormed into my aunt's house uninvited. I was there visiting, hoping to find solace in her calm presence after weeks of relentless tension. But the moment my sister barged through the door, shouting accusations at me with a venomous glare, any semblance of peace evaporated. "You've ruined everything," she screamed, her voice trembling with fury as she pointed an accusatory finger at me. "You stole my life and now you're trying to take my mother too." The stench of liquor clung to her like a toxic cloud, and her wild eyes darted between me and my aunt, who stood frozen in shock. Before either of us could react, she lunged toward me, screaming threats so vile they made my blood run cold. My aunt and I struggled to restrain her, but her strength seemed superhuman in her intoxicated state. Neighbors began to gather outside, drawn by the commotion, their horrified expressions mirroring the chaos unfolding within. "You can't act like you care anymore," she yelled at my aunt, her words cutting deeper than I expected. It wasn't just anger, it was betrayal, raw and unfiltered. As my aunt finally managed to drag her out of the house, my sister continued hurling insults from the driveway, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. That night marked a turning point. Word of the incident spread quickly, igniting a firestorm among extended family members. Some sided with my sister, claiming I had provoked her. Others quietly supported me, though none dared confront the growing rift directly. My parents called in a rage, accusing me of deliberately sabotaging the family. "How could you do this?" they demanded, their voices laced with accusation rather than concern for my safety. For the first time, I felt genuinely unsafe, not just emotionally, but physically. My aunt confided in me later that she feared for what might happen next, urging me to stay with her temporarily for protection. As days passed, the division deepened. Family gatherings became battlegrounds, with heated arguments erupting over whose fault this all was. The once unified front crumbled into factions, each member forced to choose sides. Amidst the turmoil, guilt gnawed at me, but so did fear. Every late-night text or an answered call left me on edge, wondering if my sister would escalate further. This wasn't just dysfunction anymore. It was war. And in that war, I realized I was fighting not only for closure, but for survival. The decision to start anew wasn't made lightly. It was born out of desperation, exhaustion, and a growing realization that staying entangled with my family would only continue to destroy me. After weeks of relentless emotional warfare, sleepless nights, and the suffocating weight of guilt they tried to impose on me, I knew something had to give. It wasn't just about escaping their toxicity anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, piece by shattered piece. The turning point came when I sat in my therapist's office one rainy afternoon, tears streaming down my face as I admitted, "I can't keep doing this. Every time I try to fix things, it feels like I'm drowning deeper." Her response was firm but compassionate. "Sometimes healing means letting go not because you don't care, but because you do." Those words echoed in my mind for days, solidifying what I already knew deep down. I needed space, a lot of it. The first step was professional reinvention. I approached my supervisor at work with a bold request, relocation or a transfer to another branch. To my surprise, she didn't hesitate to support me. Within weeks, I was shortlisted for a senior management position across the country, a role that promised not only financial stability, but also the chance to immerse myself in a fresh environment far from the chaos I'd left behind. Preparing for this transition consumed every waking moment. I worked 12-hour days, attended training sessions obsessively, and networked tirelessly, all while grappling with the emotional toll of severing ties with my family. When colleagues asked why I suddenly seemed so driven, I brushed them off with vague answers about new opportunities. Only a few close coworkers understood the truth, offering quiet encouragement and unwavering support during moments when I felt overwhelmed. But perhaps the hardest part was cutting contact completely. Blocking their numbers, filtering emails, and asking my aunt to stop forwarding messages felt like amputating parts of myself. There were nights when loneliness clawed at me, urging me to pick up the phone and call to hear their voices, even if it meant enduring more manipulation. But then I'd remember the years of gaslighting, the public humiliation at my sister's birthday party, and the violent confrontation at my aunt's house. Each memory reinforced my resolve. For the first time, I allowed myself to prioritize my mental health over their demands. With the money from my aunt's check, I secured an apartment in my new city, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. The rest went into a diversified portfolio, ensuring financial security for the future. As I unpacked boxes and arranged furniture, I couldn't help but marvel at the strange mix of freedom and grief washing over me. Freedom because I finally controlled my own destiny. Grief because leaving behind the remnants of my old life still stung. Therapy became my lifeline during those early months. My new therapist specialized in estrangement and familial trauma, helping me navigate the storm of emotions that came with starting over. She encouraged me to join a support group for individuals who had distanced themselves from toxic families. At first, walking into that room filled with strangers terrified me. What if they judged me? What if I couldn't articulate the depth of my pain? But as others shared their stories eerily similar to mine, I realized I wasn't alone. Their courage inspired me, reminding me that rebuilding doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing yourself. Slowly, I began rediscovering who I was outside the shadow of my family's expectations. I joined a local hiking group, finding solace in nature's quiet beauty. I took cooking classes, experimenting with flavors I never dared to try before. And late at night, I picked up painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned years ago under the pressure to excel academically. These small acts of self-expression brought unexpected joy, filling the void left by severed relationships. For the first time in decades, I felt truly alive, not defined by my career, my family's approval, or society's standards, but simply by my own terms. Yet, despite these victories, there were moments of doubt. Some mornings I woke up questioning whether I'd made the right choice. Was it selfish to walk away? Could reconciliation have been possible if I'd fought harder? But then I'd remind myself of the alternative, the endless cycle of neglect, favoritism, and pain. This path, though uncertain, offered hope. And for now, that was enough. Standing on the balcony of my new apartment, I gazed out at the sprawling city skyline bathed in golden twilight. For the first time in my life, I felt a strange yet profound sense of peace, a quiet calm that had eluded me for decades. The air smelled different here, cleaner, freer, untainted by the suffocating weight of expectations and favoritism that had defined my past. It wasn't just the physical distance from my family. It was the emotional liberation I'd fought so hard to achieve. Every decision I made, from cashing that check to severing ties, had been an act of reclaiming myself, piece by shattered piece. And now, as I stood there with the wind brushing against my face, I realized I no longer needed their validation to feel whole. But this newfound freedom didn't come without scars. There were nights when loneliness clawed at me like a relentless predator, whispering cruel reminders of what I'd lost. Memories of childhood dinners where I was ignored, or moments when my sister's laughter overshadowed my achievements, still lingered in the corners of my mind. Yet, instead of letting those memories drag me back into despair, I began using them as fuel for growth, for resilience, for building a life that was truly mine. My therapist often reminded me, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Those words became my mantra, guiding me through the darkest hours. The most surreal part of this journey was realizing how much strength I'd accumulated along the way. Moving across the country, starting a demanding new job, and navigating life without the safety net of family pushed me to confront fears I didn't know I had. I joined a hiking group not because I loved nature, but because I craved connection, real, authentic connection. I took cooking classes not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because experimenting with flavors brought me joy. Even painting, something I hadn't touched since childhood, rekindled a spark within me. These small acts of self-expression weren't just hobbies. They were declarations of independence. Still, there were days when sadness crept in, heavy and unrelenting. Missing birthdays, holidays, and even mundane family dinners left a void I couldn't ignore. But amidst the grief, hope began to bloom. Hope that one day I wouldn't flinch at the mention of family. Hope that I could look back on these years not with bitterness, but with gratitude for the lessons learned. As I unpacked the last box in my apartment, I paused to admire the blank canvas leaning against the wall, a symbol of everything I'd overcome and everything I dreamed of becoming. This was my fresh start, my chance to rewrite the story on my own terms. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, I faced it with unwavering resolve. For the first time, I wasn't running from pain, I was running toward possibility.